Hello students, good morning. So, did you all read text yesterday? So, I am starting from that ASEAN way. So, what is meant by ASEAN way? A form of interaction that is informal, non-confrontationist and cooperative. So, if the members of the ASEAN have to follow a form of interaction that is informal, non-confrontationist and cooperative, and these member states have to respect the national sovereignty of each state. Then in ASEAN, there is no desire for supranational structures and institutions like the European Union. So, by 2003, ASEAN broadened its objectives, and yesterday we were discussing about the ASEAN Economic Community. So, first one, ASEAN Security Community. Second, ASEAN Economic Community, then third, Socio-Cultural Community. So, ASEAN Security Community is based on the declaration that outstanding territorial disputes should not rise or escalate into armed confrontation. So, if there are disputes, it should be settled peacefully. Okay. It should not escalate into the level of armed conflicts. Then through different agreements, ASEAN members agreed to uphold peace, neutrality, cooperation, non-interference and respect for national differences and sovereign rights. So, the member states have reached into different agreements and they agreed to uphold these. Then ASEAN Security Community, ASEAN Regional Forum was set up in 1994. It is the third point. So, by this coordination of security and foreign policy can be established. Then second one, ASEAN Economic Community. So, primarily it is an economic association and the ASEAN region is smaller, its economy is smaller if we compare it with the other economies, US, European Union, Japan, etc. And the most important feature of ASEAN economy is that it is fast growing. Then objectives to create common market and production base within ASEAN states, then to aid social and economic development in the region. Then to improve the existing ASEAN dispute settlement mechanism to resolve economic disputes. To resolve economic disputes, it became necessary to improve the existing ASEAN dispute settlement mechanism. Then it has focused on creating free trade area FTA for investment, labor and services. Then US and China have already negotiated FTAs. So, the third point, I am starting this third one, ASEAN Socio-Cultural Community. So, the ASEAN has a vision 2020. By this vision 2020, it is envisaged that by this year, the ASEAN region will be a zone of peace, freedom and neutrality. So, we already studied that there is no importance to confrontations between different member states. So, it is envisaged that by 2020, the ASEAN region will be a zone of peace, freedom and neutrality. So this Vision 2020 encourages negotiations over conflicts in the region. So ASEAN gives importance to negotiations between the member nations. No interest in conflicts between the member states. Okay. So it can be asked for 1 mark. ASEAN Vision 2020. So it is envisaged that by 2020, the ASEAN region will be a zone of peace, freedom and neutrality, and this vision encourages negotiations. So, 2 examples are given here. ASEAN made some negotiations or mediation works at the time of Cambodian conflict. Okay, there were conflicts between Vietnam and Cambodia, so ASEAN could successfully make negotiations between the two. No need of studying this year. Okay. Then East Timor crisis. So the crisis or the conflict between Indonesia and East Timor. So it was also mediated by ASEAN. Then ASEAN meets annually to discuss East Asian cooperation. Okay. So that portion over, that broadening of its community, or that economic, then security, then socio-cultural. So I am going to the next topic, ASEAN and India. So during the time of Cold War, Indian foreign policy didn't give much attention to ASEAN. No interest with any relations, no interest in any relations with this ASEAN. But recently, India signed trade agreements with 3 ASEAN regions, Malaysia, Singapore and Thailand. So, after the Second World War or during the period of Cold War, India had no much interest in the relations with ASEAN, but now the policy changed. India signed trade agreements with 3 ASEAN regions, Malaysia, Singapore and Thailand. Then ASEAN-India Free Trade Area came into effect in 2010. So in 2010, ASEAN-India Free Trade Area came into effect. So trade barriers are reduced, import tariffs are reduced, trade of goods and services with each other became increased. So by this free trade area, trade barriers are reduced, import tariffs are reduced, then trade of goods and services with each other became increased. Clear? Then the strength of ASEAN. Strength of ASEAN lies in its policies of interaction and consultation. So the strength of ASEAN lies in its policies, that policy of neutrality, policy of cooperation, peace, freedom, etc. So this lies in its policies of interaction and consultation. Then as a regional association, ASEAN provides a political forum as Asian countries and major powers can discuss its political and security concerns. So as a regional association, these Asian countries can discuss their problems here. So it works as a political forum for the Asian countries. Okay, Asian countries and major powers can discuss their political and security issues here. So we were discussing about the alternative centers of power. So we already covered 2 topics. First one, European Union. Then second, this ASEAN. So next, the third one, China. Rise of the Chinese economy. So China is the third alternative center of power. For what? This alternative center of power to limit the powers of US. Okay. So China could win economic success after 1978, and now it is the fastest growing economy, and it has a proposal, or it projected to overtake US by 2040. So it is projected as by 2040 who will overtake US? China. Okay, China will become the largest economy. So it is the third alternative center of power, and it could win economic success after 1978, and now it is the fastest growing economy, and it is projected to overtake US by 2040 as the largest economy. And Chinese strength lies on several factors like economic strength, population, land mass, resources, regional location, and political influence. So all these help to strengthen China in the present scenario. Okay, economic strength, population, land mass, resources, regional location, and political influence. So in earlier times, China followed the Soviet model of economy. So it was formation of People's Republic of China was on 1st October 1949, and during that time they followed the Soviet model of economy. And at that time China was backward. Economically, it was a backward country, and they had no connections with the capitalist world. Okay, so after the formation of People's Republic of China in 1949, they followed the Soviet model of economy, and economically it was a backward country, and they had no connection with the capitalist world. So by getting Soviet aid and advice, China owned the state. In China, the state owned heavy industry sector, and its capital, or they invested in these industries mainly from the income they got from agriculture. Okay, so we already studied, they followed Chinese government followed the Soviet model of development. So on their advice, on the advice of Soviet Union, the state owned the heavy industries, and investment was made in the field of industries from the income that they got from agricultural sector. And for getting technology and goods, they started to give domestic goods, and China laid the foundations of its industrial economy. Okay, so heavy industries were under the control of the state, and in this field the investment was made from the income that they got from agriculture. And for getting technologically, China was backward once. Okay, so for getting technology and goods, they began to give their domestic goods. Then China laid the foundations of its industrial economy. Then the government gave much importance to social welfare. So employment and social welfare were assured to all citizens. Then education and health were also given importance. and they could attain economic growth rate of 5 to 6% in its earlier days. And at that time their population growth was 2 to 3%. So actually this economic growth rate was high in that situation. But the population growth was also in the percentage of 2 to 3. So the economic growth was insufficient because of this population growth. There was economic growth, but it was not sufficient or insufficient if we consider this population growth. So the government gave much importance to employment and social welfare, then education, health, all these were given importance. Economic growth rate in earlier days after its formation 5 to 6%. Population growth was 2 to 3%. So this economic growth was insufficient at that time. Then China witnessed a period of stagnation. The industries, for these industries, the capital from agriculture was not sufficient. Okay, I already taught that in the industrial sector they made investment through the income of agriculture, but it was not sufficient. That investment was not sufficient in the industrial sector. And the state-controlled Chinese industries began to decline. And at that time, international trade was minimal. Per capita income also became low. So, it could, in earlier days, China could attain economic growth of 5 to 6%, but we already studied that it was not sufficient because of the population growth. Then in the industrial field, the investment was not sufficient and the state-controlled Chinese industries began to decline. International trade was minimal, then per capita income began to come in the lower status. Then the Chinese government began to change its policies. Okay. So it started in 1970s. In 1970s, the Chinese government began to change its policy decisions. So they decided to avoid their political and economic isolation. We already studied that they had no connections with the capitalist world. So now they decided to change that policy and the relations with the US. They started the relations with the US in 1972. So by starting relations with the US in 1972, their political and economic isolation ended. And the Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai proposed 4 modernizations in 1973. Agricultural, industrial, then in the field of science, science and technology, then military modernization. So, who was the Chinese premier in 70s? Zhou Enlai. So, in 1973, he made a proposal of 4 modernization in the field of agriculture, then industries, science and technology, and military. So, because of the backwardness of Chinese economy, the government decided to change its policy decisions in 70s. So, in 1972, they started relations with the US, and this brought about their brought about a change in their policy, or political and economic isolation came to an end. Then in 1973, the Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai proposed 4 modernization: agriculture, industry, science and technology, and military. So, in 1978, the leader of the time, Deng Xiaoping, he started the open door policy, and economic reforms were started in 1978. So its aim was higher productivity by investments of capital and technology from abroad. So they wanted to attract the foreign investors to their own country. So what was the aim of the open door policy of 1978? Higher productivity by investments of capital and technology from abroad. So China followed a new policy of market economy, and they opened their economy step by step. When we studied about USSR, what was the policy of the government there? That shock therapy. But Chinese government didn't go behind that policy of shock therapy. They opened their economy step by step. And in 1982, the field of agriculture, the agriculture sector was privatized. And in 1998, the industrial sector was also privatized. So new policy of market economy was followed by China. They opened their economy step by step, didn't follow the Soviet policy of shock therapy. Then in 1982, agriculture was privatized. Then in 1998, industrial sector was privatized. Then trade barriers were eliminated in CES, Special Economic Zones. Okay, trade barriers were eliminated. And in CES, only the foreign investors could set up enterprises. So you already studied about special economic zones in economics. So in these regions, in special economic zones, who can invest? Only the foreign investors could set up enterprises. Then the state has the central role in setting up a market economy. So privatization was there, but who controlled this? The market economy was controlled by the government, by the state. So trade barriers were eliminated in special economic zones, and in these special economic zones, only the foreign investors could set up enterprises. Then the state took the key role of setting up a market economy. So now China witnessed development, or began to witness development. So new economic policies were followed by Chinese government. So it gave a break from the period of stagnation. Okay, so new economic policies were followed by the Chinese government, and as a result of this open door policy of the Chinese government, they could bring about a break from stagnation. Then privatization of agriculture. Because of this privatization of agriculture, there was a rise in agricultural production and rural incomes. So as the rural income increased, they could invest more in rural industries. So through the privatization of agriculture, there was a rise in agricultural production and rural incomes. So they could invest more in rural industries. Then the Chinese economy in the Chinese economy, both the agriculture and industry grew at a faster rate. They never ignored this field, agriculture. While we studying the Indian politics, we found that agriculture was when the India government gave importance to the industrial sector, agriculture was neglected. But in the Chinese economy, both these sectors were given equal importance and grew at a faster rate. So new trading laws and creation of cess increased foreign trade. So they could increase foreign trade through these new trading laws and creation of special economic zone. Then China has now become the most important destination for foreign direct investment. So nowadays China is the most important destination for foreign direct investment. Then China began to invest in other countries, and in 2001 China became the member of World Trade Organization. So as a result of the new trading laws and creation of special economic zone, China could increase foreign trade. Then China has now become the most important destination for foreign direct investment. China began to invest in other countries. Then it became member of World Trade Organization in the year 2001. So once again I am revising that China. Okay. So Chinese economy or the rise of China as the third alternative center of power, it could win economic success only after 1978, and now it is the fastest growing economy, and it is projected that by 2040 China would overtake the US as the largest economy. Then Chinese strength is dependent on several factors like economic strength, population, landmass, resources, regional location, and political influence. Then in earlier times or after its formation, immediately after its formation in 1949, China followed the Soviet model of development. So its economy was backward, and at that time China had no connection with the capitalist world. And on Soviet aid and advice, in China heavy industries were owned by the state, and investment was mainly from agriculture, and for getting technology and goods they began to give their domestic goods. Then China laid foundations of its industrial economy. Then employment and social welfare were given assured to all citizens, and as a part of this, education and health were given importance. Economic growth rate was 5 to 6%, but there was a population growth of 2 to 3%, so the economic growth became insufficient. Then China saw the period of stagnation, no sufficient capital from agriculture in the field of industries. State-controlled Chinese industries began to decline. Then international trade was minimal. Then per capita income became low. Then the Chinese government began to change its policies from 1970s. Political and economic isolation came to an end with the beginning of relations with the US in 1972. Then Chinese premier proposed 4 modernizations in 1973: agriculture, industry, science and technology, and military modernization. Then in 1972, the Chinese government started open door policy, and they brought about economic reforms, and its aim was higher productivity by investments of capital and technology from abroad. Then China followed a new policy of market economy. They never followed the policy of shock therapy. They opened their economy step by step. In 82, agriculture was privatized. Then in 98, industry was privatized. Then trade barriers were eliminated in CES, and in CES, only the foreign investors could set up enterprises. So state began to control the market economy. The new economic policies could bring about break from stagnation. Privatization of agriculture resulted in the rise of agricultural production and rural incomes, so they could invest more in rural industries. The Chinese economy gave importance to both the agricultural and industrial sectors, and both these grew at a faster rate. The new trading laws and creation of CES increased foreign trade. Then China has now become the most important destination for foreign direct investment. China began to invest in other countries. Then it became member of World Trade Organization in the year 2001. So we can meet again on Monday, okay?